Right, well here we are towards the middle of Dawlish now, the new middle of Dawlish, because as I said last time, the centre of Dawlish was really around the parish church. But towards the end of the 18th century, after Dawlish had slumbered for hundreds of years, there was a sudden awakening of Dawlish as George III, the king at the time, before he went completely mad, was extolling the virtues of being beside the sea. And of course Dawlish is beside the sea. And why did he extol the virtues? Well, he thought that the sea air, the ozone, was good for invalids, for the unwell. He thought that bathing in the sea was good for the body, and he even thought that drinking seawater was good for the insides as well. So places along the sea, along the coast, such as Brighton and Eastbourne and Bournemouth, places like that which grew into Georgian resorts. The smaller places like Dawlish, they became popular as well. And Dawlish at this time, really, the whole of the central Dawlish was not much more than fishermen's cottages. There were no important buildings apart from the parish church way at the back of the town. There was nothing here apart from a mill, which we'll talk about a bit later. Well, at this time, towards the end of the 18th century, Dawlish had actually, or the manor of Dawlish had been owned by the cathedral at St Peter's in Exeter since 1072. And it was towards the end of the 18th century that the high and mighty within the cathedral decided that the manor of Dawlish should be sold off, and it was sold off under the Redemption of Land Tax Act, which meant that the cathedral could pay one huge amount of tax for all the lands that they owned, a bit like council tax or rates or whatever, and once they had paid a big amount, then future taxes on their land wouldn't count. And they decided that the manor of Dawlish wasn't really that important to them, so therefore they raised money, paid taxes elsewhere, and Dawlish was an independent town. And it was bought by three very wealthy gentlemen, one of whom we'll concentrate on was a chap called John Ede Manning, and it was he who decided that Dawlish would become a premier resort in Devon. He wanted the wealthy Georgians to resort to Dawlish for their, not just their mini breaks or their week's holiday, but for the season, because of course travel at this time was extremely difficult. Dawlish wasn't very accessible. There was no stagecoach, there was no train, there were no other vehicles, so the only way that people could travel to Dawlish was by horse and cart, or on horseback, or in their private coaches. And of course there weren't any wealthy people around here to be able to travel by their own private coach. And the only way, if you wanted to travel afar, was to go by horse and cart over the hill to Chudley and pick up the stagecoach which ran from Exeter to Plymouth and called at Chudley. And that was the way people used to travel. The road up to Exeter along the coast that we know just didn't exist at that time. It was no more than a pothole track. Towards the end of the 18th century, when all this was happening, the centre of Dawlish, where we're standing now on the lawn, was nothing more than a marshy waste. It was a tidal inlet, so that during high tides and easterly storms, the sea used to come right the way in, right the way up to Brooklands behind us, and so the whole of the central area was boggy, smelly, wet, marshy, very welcoming for these wealthy Georgian tourists. And it was John Ede Manning who decided that the only way to encourage more people to come to Dawlish was to actually make it look like a tourist hotspot. So what he did was straighten the brook, which sounds quite a simple thing, it's an easy thing to say, but the thought of straightening the brook without any mechanical means was being quite an endeavour. And whereas we see now the brook in a nice straight line with a block or a wall either side and little waterfalls and all the rest of it, it was just meandered across the lawn here, and as I say, at high tide the sea used to come in and it wasn't tidal in there. And that's why the two sides of Dawlish, the Brunswick Place and the Strand, are quite so far apart. You would have thought that maybe the Strand would have been built nearer so that it was more like a town centre, but this was all a tidal waste. And it was he who straightened the brook, and if you read my book, Dawlish Through the Ages, you will actually learn how he did it. But of course, all the residents at that time were his tenants, so he basically owned everybody who lived in Dawlish, and he must have had a huge amount of labour to do what he did. And I think in very basic terms, he had to stop up the way the river, or the brook as we call it, the way the brook was running, divert it so that he could create what he called a canal, which is brick lined, where the brook is now, it's all brick lined, and then re-divert the water into his canal. He then raised the level of the ground around it, the marshy waste, which he did by bringing earth and stones off the beach, and from Queen Street, which he created, and from Strand Hill, which he created. All the waste that came out of those, he raised the level of the ground here by about a yard, 3 feet, nearly a metre in current terminology, so that he reckoned that it wouldn't flood anymore, and he could create the pleasure gardens, not quite as we see them now, but pretty much as we see them. And it worked for a couple of years. This was in 1807 he did this. In 1810 there was a huge storm one November night, and the sea came crashing in, destroyed everything that he had done, swept away cottages, swept away horses. Luckily it didn't sweep away any people, but all the work that he had done was undone, and he had to redo it again. It was his idea that yes, it was going to be redone. Even the repairs cost him £11,000, which is over £1 million in today's money. So it was a big undertaking, and it left him quite short of money, but he did do other things in Dawlish. Now at the same time, the Strand that we see here wasn't known as the Strand. Marine Parade was the Strand at that time, because that was, the Strand was where the sand and the sea was. The Strand didn't really have a name at that time, and it was lined by fishermen's cottages. The fishermen, as I said last week, lived down near the sea. The agricultural workers lived up near the church, and this was it was called Dawlish Strand because it was near the sea, and this was the little hamlet where the fishermen lived. And what he didn't want was the local fisher folk, the poor fisher folk, rubbing shoulders with the wealthy Georgians who came to visit Dawlish. So therefore he uprooted them and built cottages for them at the back of the town, and he started to build the rather nice houses and villas that are here now. And okay, that you might think, well, they're just shops with flats above them, but these were rather nice townhouses which were either bought by wealthy Georgians or rented by them or used as lodging rooms. And it was later that the shops came down below. All the shop fronts weren't shop fronts at that time. They were actually rather nice houses with little gardens at the front. And the original cottages were built a bit further back. And if you go out the back of some of these properties now, there are still the remains of the cottages that were built in the 16th, 17th and 18th century. So there's a lot of history hidden behind the facades that you see now. And even the facades that you see now weren't actually built at that time. Just turning around and looking behind here. Around 1800, the population of Dawlish was about just a couple of thousand people, so it really wasn't anything more than a big village. And that village was in two parts, back of the church and back down here by the Strand. But in the intervening years, over the next 20 or 30 years, it meant that because John Ede Manning had a bit of a clearance of the fisher folk from here, that the space between the front and the back of Dawlish actually got filled in. It was greenery, it was fields, it was orchards, it was just arable land and allotments, but more and more cottages were built. Well, by the time John Ede Manning had acquired the manor of Dawlish, it was already attracting wealthy Georgians from far and wide, and they would turn up not just for a week or two, but they would come down for the summer season. They'd bring their families, they'd bring their servants, they'd come either by private coach or they would take the stagecoach to Exeter and then horse and cart down to Dawlish. And they didn't want to stay in little fishermen's cottages, so it was that builders started to build larger properties from about 1780, and those large cots, as they were called, the larger houses, weren't built right down here in the town centre because, of course, at that time there was still the brook which meandered across the lawn. So if we look behind, we've got a row of houses here which I'll talk about in a minute, but behind that it's almost like a cliff, and at the top of the cliff we've got Plantation Terrace, and in Plantation Terrace there were several large cots or houses built in the Gothic style. So between 1780 and 1800, Plantation Terrace, and down on Marine Parade, which was then known as the Strand, was where the bigger houses were built. That's where the wealthy Georgians stayed. And of course that brought employment to local people. It meant that local builders, masons, carpenters, domestic staff, servants, there was more and more for local people to do, and that meant that as the agricultural revolution became the industrial revolution, more people moved from the villages into towns such as Dawlish, Teignmouth and other bigger places, and that was where the employment was. There wasn't so much employment in the countryside because the agricultural revolution had meant that farm machinery had taken away many of the jobs from there. So places like Dawlish actually became a magnet for more people to live. And it was here that the Georgians wanted to come more and more. Well, by 1810, more and more people wanted to come, and the roads were improved. Between Exeter and Dawlish, the road was improved to such an extent that we had a stagecoach service which started, and instead of people just coming by private coach or horse and cart, a dozen or 15 people could come at a time, 5 or 6 times a day on their coaches. And in 1800, just before that, was when the first hotel was built in Dawlish. And that was built at the bottom of the Strand, where Co-op and Coral are now. There was a big hotel called the London Hotel, which was a lovely old Georgian place, and that's where Georgians stayed as well. If they wanted to be looked after well, the London Hotel was the place to be, and that's where the stagecoach used to drop off and pick up people. Well, whilst the Strand was being developed and named by John Ede Manning as Pleasant Row, as he thought that was rather a nice name to attract people to buy or rent his houses there, this side of the brook, where we're over on Brunswick Place, was very much undeveloped. It was grassy slopes which went to the cliff face, which went up to Piermont Place, and the only building this side up until the late 18th century was Brunswick Mill, or the Strand Mill as it was called, which we'll go and have a look at on another occasion. But in 1717 that was built, and it was the only building on the side of the river. The rest of it, as I say, was just ignored by the population, by the visitors and so forth. And it was this side, the only track up here was where the farmers used to come to get their corn ground up and milled. So this side of the river wasn't developed, but the rest of it started to look as we see it now. A lot of the buildings, in fact most of the buildings, were built from about 1809 up to about 1820. Some have been replaced. The banks bought premises towards the end of the 19th century and built their fine banking halls, but generally speaking the architecture over there is very much Georgian. Now John Ede Manning, once he had developed the Strand side, thought, well, okay, yes, I've got pleasure gardens and I've got a nice brook and we've got a few waterfowl, people will come to see that, but the actual utilities that people had to make their lives easier didn't exist. There was no mains drainage, there was no water supply, you couldn't turn a tap on in the house, there was no electric or gas lighting, and he therefore decided that we needed places for the Georgians to go where they could wash, so he built public baths down on Marine Parade, or the Strand as it was known, and he also built public reading rooms where the wealthy could go and read the newspapers of the day. There was a library there as well, and they were well lit places with oil lamps and candles, but electricity, gas and water all came later. And what we'll do next time is move down a little bit nearer to the seafront, and we will talk about the reading rooms, and I'll show you where they were, and we'll start talking about the railway.